And so some people, reductionistically think that they don't have any structural explanation, that these are just, random coincidences, that can be explained by cognitive bias. On the other side are the mystical interpretations, that there's energy transference, um, and messages from a transcendent world. For me, it's really this middle ground that has a structural explanation, in which the meaning of synchronicity, it's an emergent property, just like a whirlpool is an emergent property of the complex molecules of water that require different explanations, that have novel properties that can be explained through fluid dynamics. So in this case, it's not just a subjective projection or interpretation, but rather the meaning is emerging collectively through the system, through the complexity of the internal and external world. Those two systems combined give rise to synchronicities as real, objective, emergent properties of that complex system. The coherence constrains the interpretation. The meaning is emerging through the relationship between the observer and the external world, and that organization exists independently of whether anyone notices it. And so cognition is designed to detect organization. That's how our brains have evolved. And attention amplifies what becomes psychologically meaningful. So interpretation shapes personal experience. And interpretation matters, but at the same time, it remains grounded in real structural relationships.
Well, we're back here again on Connecting with Coincidence, and we have a remarkable guest today. A very remarkable guest in many ways. And why do I say that? Because I've known Rob Sacco for a long time. And he is one of the most careful researchers in meaningful coincidences that I have had the pleasure of knowing. And it's been a little bit of a problem persuading him, actually, waiting for him to decide to be on this program. There aren't too many people doing research in synchronicity and really doing quality research as well as quantitatively dependent research. And Rob Sacco is one of them. And I'll tell you a little bit about him. He's an independent researcher and writer whose work explores the emergence meaning of synchronicity and temporal organization through the lenses of complex systems, information theory, and constraint-based dynamics. He is the creator of the Fibonacci LifeChart framework, an interdisciplinary model that investigates harmonic timing structures and relational coherence in human experience. His research integrates ideas from systems theory, statistical physics, probability, and philosophy to develop scientific approaches to meaning and synchronicity. Scientific approaches to meaning and synchronicity. He continues to develop interdisciplinary framework for understanding structure, transformation, and human experience of synchronicity across scales. Rob, it's about time, and thank you for being here with me today.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Well, I'm glad. And let's start with Rob. What is synchronicity? Would summarize the framework that you use to understand synchronicity.
Sure. So most people describe synchronicity as a meaningful coincidence, an alignment between events that don't appear causally connected, yet somehow feel deeply related. I think that's a good phenomenological description because it captures how synchronicity is experienced. But I think the deeper question is not what synchronicity feels like, but how we should understand it. And so, from my perspective, synchronicity is the emergence of coherence across semi independent systems developing under shared constraints.
Now let's have a repeat on that because it's fundamental to the way you are thinking.
Yeah.
It's a coherence among apparently independent systems
Yeah.
at around the same time because timing is so very, very important to how you're thinking about these things.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So rather than it simply being a coincidence with meaning attached to it, it's really the perception of previously hidden organization becoming visible.
Previously hidden becoming visible. That's one of the reasons I've been interested in meaningful coincidence because I want to know like what really is going on around here because these are clues. These
Yeah.
meaningful
Yeah.
coincidence, they're clues to an underlying reality. And
Yeah.
you have been trying to be able to describe that underlying reality.
Yeah. That's right.
So what is it, Rob?
So yeah, it's just really that. It's the experience is one of coherence becoming visible across multiple levels of organization. So external events seem to align, internal psychological states align as well. Timing becomes unusually significant. Symbols, relationships, and experiences, they converge into meaningful patterns.
Experiences that converge into meaningful patterns. Now, of
Yeah,
course, you know there's a problem with the word meaning. Uh, there's about a lot of different meanings to the word meaning.
yeah.
So, since you take things apart, what is meaning here when these patterns cohere with each other?
Yeah, so for me, meaning is really relational rather than intrinsic. So I think coming at things from a relational and systems-based perspective, I think that it's really relationships between events that create the depth and coherence. Um, so it's not necessarily that organization itself is existing intrinsically, but rather meaning emerges from coherence. And so it's a very much it's a relational pattern.
Uh, Many people have said, including Bateson, that it's all relation, Gregory Bateson, and
Yeah.
we tend to be stuck on I'm me, and that's what I got. But we don't know me unless we're in a relationship with something. And please elaborate on that relational necessity.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So really it's this framework is shifting the focus from how we're used to normally thinking about things. Usually we think that things exist out there in the world rather than things existing as relationships. So an example would be a whirlpool. So a whirlpool has a collective organization, a pattern that all the molecules are existing in relationship to. The molecules of water themselves are not what's fundamental to the pattern. So the molecules of water are coming and going. But if we think of those water molecules as being fundamental to the whirlpool, it's a different way of thinking about things instead of as process, instead of as relationship. So really, this relational based understanding is shifting how we are used to normally thinking about things existing out there in the world. And it also involves shifting the focus from causes to constraints and from isolated events to patterns of organization. So it really is a different type of worldview that I think is emerging.
Yeah, it's this constraints thing that is a very heavily loaded word,
Yeah.
and I relate it easily to the idea of free will that we believe, many are told, we have free will. Well, free will means my will can do anything it wants to. It's free. But the reason we have to use the word free is because we kind of know that there are constraints on what we're able to do. And those constraints have to do with our own biology and where we are in physical space and some of our past history and a whole bunch of other things.
Hmm.
So when you think about constraints and synchronicity, what are you thinking about?
Well, I think the easiest way to understand the concept of constraints is if we think about a billiards table. So there's billiard balls that are on the table in that we're used to thinking in terms of causes. So one billiard ball is striking into another, and that's a cause. But this is shifting the focus to the constraint of the shape of the billiards table itself. So the shape of the billiards ball table can influence the trajectories of the billiard balls themselves indirectly. And so that's what I mean by a constraint, that the overall system is shaping individual trajectories. And so this is not uh, how we're used to thinking about things as being caused, because in this case, there can be constraints that are existing in the overall system that are influencing the trajectories individually.
And let's bring that into Carl Jung and how he missed the idea of constraints. Uh, Certainly, he helped us notice uh, meaningful coincidences and used the story, the scarab dream and the scarab-like beetle showing up at the window around the same time that the patient was describing a dream of a golden scarab.
Mhm.
Well, that has become the classical idea of synchronicity. But there's a few things wrong with that one. And I'd ask you to comment on what constraints Jung was missing and just what did he miss in describing synchronicity.
Oh, sure. So Jung recognized that meaningful coincidences could occur without direct causation. And so the insight was remarkably ahead of its time. But what remained missing was a systems level explanation for how these patterns can emerge. So I think Jung identified the acausal connection and symbolic significance, but he lacked the modern systems theory, which adds emergence, recursive organization, probability, and constraint dynamics. Um, so, yeah, in that case, the question becomes how does organization emerge in the first place?
Well, tell us.
Well, it's interesting because Jung, I think, was really close. He suggested that the Fibonacci sequence was somehow involved in an explanation for the mechanism. So he really identified the phenomenon before system science could explain it mechanistically, and he saw the pattern long before we had the tools to understand how it forms. But it was really interesting that he, in one of his letters, described how he thought that the Fibonacci sequence was somehow this bridge between mind and matter. So I think that was really remarkable. Um, and so, yeah.
Well, we have stumbled across, not really stumbled, because Fibonacci is central to a lot of your thinking, as are its related phenomenon of fractals. So I think it's important at this point in our conversation that you describe the Fibonacci and then its relation to fractals, and then the way in which mind and matter might be thought of as more of one, as connected with each other than we currently believe.
Okay. So when we think about the Fibonacci harmonics, there's a big question. Why do Fibonacci harmonic patterns appear across complex systems? So they appear in biology, physics, psychology, human development, and we could sort of think about it in two broad explanations. One is that, um, for explaining the origin of Fibonacci harmonics, is that these patterns may be fundamental to reality, that space and time may possess an underlying Fibonacci structure, that biological systems then reflect this deeper architecture. And so, in this view, Fibonacci organization would be intrinsic to nature. Um, I take a different view on this. I think that Fibonacci harmonics are emergent informational invariants. So, this means that they arise through recursive organization under shared constraints. They're not fundamental properties of time itself. So Fibonacci scaling then is emergent and not fundamental. In the proposed mechanism for this kind of statistical emergence is large scale order can emerge from microscopic randomness. So we know that individual biological processes are very noisy and unpredictable. Our thoughts are very all over the place some of the time. Um, but this collective recursive organization can produce stable harmonic patterns. So our thoughts can also be focused. So there's this balance between noise and predictability. And so what I'm saying is that the precision of the Fibonacci harmonics, they belong to the system collectively, not its parts.
That is a major claim, Rob, that they belong to the system itself. Now, I think we need to back up a bit for our audience, as well as for me a little bit, is what is the Fibonacci sequence? And along with that is your remarkable claim, which comes from systems thinking or complex systems theory. They get a bunch of like wacko molecules bumping into each other, and they're just kind of like look like they're just bumping into each other. But you do enough of them over a period of time, and they begin to form a pattern.
Yeah.
And that pattern, you're saying, is related to the Fibonacci sequence. And that is an important claim to make. I mean, there's some complex systems, the famous butterfly that comes out of a chaos theory, one of the chaos things when you got a lot of stuff happening around here, but then you get a butterfly shape, and that's where it first came, and then that would happen again, at least first came to my awareness. And here you're saying in more complex systems, you can get a lot of what looks like randomness organizing itself into a much more fundamental thing than a butterfly, but into Fibonacci harmonics. So we need to be able to divine.
Mhm.
We need, there's a divinatory process going here, Rob. We need to define what we mean by uh, Fibonacci harmonics.
Yeah. So that's really it. The idea is that the law of large numbers. So when we aggregate many microscopic particles, we can get emergent effects. Um, just like we can get an overall pressure and temperature reading in a box of molecules, but we can't predict the individual mm, particles' trajectories themselves. In the aggregate, we get statistical predictions, and that's what emergence is all about. It's about novel properties, new levels of explanations that don't exist at the lower levels themselves. And so that I think this is really what Fibonacci numbers are, that they're statistical emergent properties that emerge from aggregate parts and systems. So every system is made up of parts that are interacting. And as they interact recursively, they constrain the overall possibility space. Uh, and this recursion expanding over time is what creates the Fibonacci scaling in the aggregate in complex systems. So they really emerge through a recursive accumulation. And so that's how I view this, as that the harmonic organization is emerging from recursive structure, but it doesn't exist fundamentally, intrinsically in the reality. It's rather an emergent property of complex systems.
Complex systems with its parts interacting with each other. And
Yeah.
let's pause for a little bit about the law of large numbers and bring it to a simple, everyday kind of understanding. The law of large numbers can be easily seen with coin flipping
Yeah.
of heads or tails.
Hmm.
We know from theoretical work and our own experience that it's a 50% probability that you're going to get one or the other. But if you do a large number of coin flips, the early ones might have more heads and later ones more tails. But you do that with a large enough set of numbers, you're going to get that 50% heads and 50% tails. And this
Exactly.
and this simple example is what you're elaborating further when you don't get just a heads or a tails. It's just two things going back and forth. You got a lot of stuff going on in this reality. And when you have a lot of different apparently random events, which the coin flipping could be considered, it's random each one because you never know what the next one's going to be. But you do that in the aggregate, and then you start getting an emergent property. In this case, 50-50 is what you're going to get when you do it a lot of times. And the same thing seems to be and is what you're saying when you get highly complex systems with lots of different variables, a lot of different coins of all different kinds, flipping with each other and moving around, then what emerges from that is Fibonacci harmonics.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I think it's a very mysterious thing that we get these emergent properties through the law of large numbers. I think it's extraordinarily interesting that 50% in the long-term aggregate of the coin flipping emerges that way. It's very strange, I think, that systems in the aggregate end up having these emergent properties. But that's exactly how I'm thinking about this. That, when people have synchronicities, it's not just that they happen in the aggregate at these Fibonacci harmonics. Uh, they can also happen at different organizational levels, just like the coins flipping can not be at the, there could be a string of heads or tails before the convergence at that 50%. But what makes that convergence at the 50% is that clustering of tendency and probability. In the Fibonacci harmonics have a multi-scale coherent relationship, so that the prediction is really that the harmonic synchronicities that arise from that multi-scale alignment have different statistical properties than background synchronicities that arise from more local coherence. So I think synchronicity is happening all over the place, but it has different properties when it uh, is happening more at those probabilistically more at those Fibonacci aggregate scaling because they have a multi-scale relationship.
Uh, how do different systems that are maybe semi-aligned with each other and not aligned with each other, how do they become aligned in a way that becomes what we might call a synchronicity?
Yeah, so semi-independent systems can exist within overlapping environments. So there's shared constraints that can shape their development and channel them towards compatible trajectories. So they don't need to interact directly to display similar patterns of organization. Um, a way we could think about this is imagine two rivers that naturally converge because they flow through the same landscape. So the shape of the mountain can constrain the trajectory of two different rivers that are from two different locations into the same trajectory of convergence. So this is how semi-independent systems can end up aligning.
And they align because of the constraints of the environment in which both of them are playing or doing or flowing.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so there's this interplay between constraint, recursion, and fractals. If we think about a tree growing, there's the constraints of the environment, the conditions in which the seed is planted, the genetics of the tree. Um, and as each tree bud grows, um, it's recursively enacting its developmental rule, and so ends up having this overall fractal shape. So that's what I mean by constraints are shaping the trajectory of the system, and not predicting any individual path exactly, but giving an overall shape to the possibility space.
You use the word recursion as one of your fundamental words uh, in talking about this, as well as coherence and resonance, which we haven't gotten to yet. But what do you mean by this word of interacting in a way that is called recursion?
Yeah, so recursion is just taking the output of a system and feedbacking it into an input so that the input and outputs have a coupling relation. Um, and so that gives rise to resonance, which is structural compatibility rather than a hidden energy transfer. So it's really about compatible forms of organization that are reinforcing one another while incompatible forms gradually disappear.
Would you be so kind, Rob, is to take recursion and coherence in this abstract way that you're describing it and bring it to what we have as interpersonal relationships?
Yeah, so I think if we imagine a coincidence, for example, in terms of interpersonal relationships, that would be happening because the two people have they share a harmonious structure, but not because they're communicating or sharing energy transfer. It's rather the constraint dynamics of each individual trajectory is shaping the convergence of both people into a way that's harmonious. Just kind of like musical instruments, they resonate because they share a harmonious structure, not because they're communicating.
I have trouble with that because to me, harmonic and resonance are vibrational energy. And you seem to be I don't think you're doing it, but you seem to be removing energy from the idea of harmonics.
Well, actually, yeah, I am from this relational systems-based framework. I do think about that differently, how resonance works. I don't think about it in terms of morphic resonance or hidden field that's involved or a universal signal mechanism or non-locality. I don't think that this explanation requires um, those kind of energy-based transference principles. I think it's more simply described structurally. So yeah, this framework doesn't require mind-to-mind communication, manifesting uh, thoughts, shaping reality, messages, cosmic guidance, these metaphysical ideas that involve uh, energy transference or systems that are somehow communicating. I know a lot of the time quantum principles are used to explain synchronicity, but I think that quantum physics underlies reality at the fundamental level, sure, but synchronicity, it's explained structurally rather than quantum mechanically. So, uh,
Yeah, yeah, I don't trust that idea of two electrons entangled. Somehow there's something wrong with it. Um,
yeah.
and there got to be something underneath them that may be explaining it. But let's go back to the to tuning forks. Uh, you got a tuning fork in one hand, I got a tuning fork in another hand,
Hmm.
and I being one of them or somebody does, and the other one starts vibrating. That
Yeah.
looks like energy being transferred across a space.
Yeah. But that alignment of the resonance doesn't require a hidden transmission. It doesn't require a hidden field. It's really just selective amplification that is strengthening those stable structures.
Okay. So I'm going to tell you a coincidence story from of two, we can call them semi-independent individuals, me and somebody else who I just getting to know. Uh, and one of my kind of variation on Jung's scarab dream is my dog getting lost when I was 9 years old or so. That's one of my favorites because it was my first, and it illustrates a lot of different things. So my dog got lost, and I went looking for him, and I got lost looking for him, and we found each other. The street that it happened on uh, was a street in Shaker Heights, Ohio, which I found out yesterday was called Van Aken. I didn't know the name Van Aken, I just heard it, but I called it the Big Street. So I was talking with somebody yesterday who I'm just getting to know, and she's from Shaker Heights. And she knew the name Van Aken, and so I now can say it. And at a different time, about 2 blocks from where my dog and I found each other, she was, I think, a teenager or perhaps younger, walking along and standing under a blossoming tree. And as she stood there, that tree dropped all its blossoms on her, and she was like blowing the blossoms the way people blow dandelion uh, s- stuff off when the dandelion is starting to die. So that that we were 2 blocks away at a different time uh, was something we both marveled at because it was both very meaningful to each of us, a coincidence to her and to me. And then I could tell her that a friend of mine were hiking once, not too long ago, in woods near here, up a mountain. And Julie and I sang to the trees, which I do fairly regularly. I sing to the trees. Then she did. And after she finished, there was an acorn storm like the blossoms from that tree on Van Aken. Neither of us were hit by them. So we had these location and experience similarities. And that was a resonant experience for each of us. It somehow established a coherence, at least for the moment, between us.
Yeah. 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 It's amazing how these things happen. I've just been really interested in what larger organizational structures are making these kinds of events possible. Um, and so yeah, I think these meaningful coincidences, these synchronicities, they're a visible surface of a much deeper coherence that's always there. I think it only becomes visible at certain times, but I think the coherence is always existing. Um, and we only see it at certain times, like you just described.
Uh, we we only find out about it when we tell each other. I mean, I think that's a key part of this. And another key part of it that I insist be recognized as part of synchronicity is that somebody's got to notice it, that it's a mental event. Synchronicity is something someone notices enough to be able to say, oh, as I just did with three different ones, that's a meaningful coincidence or that's a synchronicity. So, where does an individual mind that has to make note of a synchronicity, how does that play a part in the underlying coherence that you're describing?
I think it makes a really big difference. I think that the coherence that emerges is objective. I don't think that it's just subjectively within an individual's interpretation. But definitely, I think the observer participates in recognizing coherence. So the meaning depends on pattern detection, but the patterns themselves are not purely subjective. It
Well,
remains, yeah,
eh,
grounded in real structural relationships.
yeah, real structural relationships. So at the beginning, you were telling us it's all relational, and now you're telling me that that coherence is underlying whether I see it or not.
Yeah, from this systems-based perspective, the emergence of of coincidences and synchronicities, for example, they are real properties of complex systems. Um, and so some people, reductionistically think that they don't have any structural explanation, that these are just, random coincidences, that can be explained by cognitive bias. On the other side, are the mystical interpretations that there's energy transference, um, and messages from a transcendent world. For me, it's really this middle ground that has a structural explanation, in which the meaning of synchronicity, it's an emergent property, just like a whirlpool is an emergent property of the complex molecules of water that require different explanations, that have a novel properties that can be explained through fluid dynamics. So just as the shape of the overall whirlpool itself is autonomous, it's a holistic pattern of that complex system, and it's objectively real as a novel property of that system. I think synchronicities also, at the psychological cognitive level, have a novel explanation that needs new descriptions and explanations to describe it. And so in this case, it's not just a subjective projection or interpretation, but rather the meaning is emerging collectively through the system, through the complexity of the internal and external world. Those two systems combined give rise to synchronicities as real objective emergent properties of that complex system. So it's a the emergence framework is really a different way of thinking about this because it's not that at least from this interpretation, it's not that these synchronicities have a transcendent, objectively discoverable uh, property that they exist out there, kind of like block universe that they're waiting just to be detected, but rather they are emerging as properties of the complex system, and that they're generated. That that in this way the synchronicities are actually generated through the recursive expansion of the system itself. So they're generated internally and emergent in that sense.
They're generated internally by the system that they're in. Now, I'm trying to see if I can get to what we started with, that everything is relational. We were talking about that when we started. And to me, you can get this emergent coherence come from a complex system interacting with its parts recursively. But then there is the relationship between the observer who observes these complex patterns and brings what I will call meaning to it or notices meaning. It depends on where you're talking about. But my question is still the synchronicities that you are describing that emerge from complex systems are also in relationship to the observer. And if I'm going to try to say what I thought you saw at the beginning, is that it's that relationship that makes it exist, not one by itself.
Yeah, that's right. So both systems are constraining each other. So the coherence constrains the interpretation. The meaning is emerging through the relationship between the observer and the external world, and that organization exists independently of whether anyone notices it. Um, and so cognition is designed to detect organization. That's how our brains have evolved. And attention amplifies what becomes psychologically meaningful. So interpretation shapes personal experience. And interpretation matters, but at the same time, it remains grounded in real structural relationships.
Yeah, you keep talking about real, uh, and that's where I'm having trouble. It's real whether I notice it or not, is what you keep saying.
Yeah, so for me, reality is fundamentally relational. So it's not just all randomness, but reality is not over constrained so that it's determinism either. Really, structured reality is an emergent organization. Uh, so it has emergent descriptions at every level.
It has emergent descriptions at every level. Would you explain that?
Yeah, so it's just basically how science works, right? So we wouldn't have science at all if we didn't have different levels of explanation. So we need different levels of explanation for uh, different uh, properties of the system. So atoms have their own explanations, and molecules have their explanations, biology has its own explanations, and so emergence has to have different levels of explanation, and that's why we create different scientific disciplines. So, easy way to think about it is the difference between a blink and a wink, right? So, blinks happen all the time unconsciously. They're just properties of our nervous system. Uh, the muscles in the eye, these things are happening all the time. But if we, wink at someone, that has a different understanding of what that means. But that wink is only different from the blink because we understand the relationships in the social, psychological level of what that's supposed to mean in the system of relationships that we all agree on, right? So that's an example of an emergent property that can't be explained just in terms of the movement of the eye muscles. So that reductionist explanation, it doesn't work for, or at least it doesn't make sense for properties that are emergent and have new levels of explanation in terms of their holistic properties as to how they relate to the entirety of the system itself, right?
All right. Okay. Um, One of the common observations about synchronicity is that is timing is so important, and part of timing is that synchronicities tend to occur around transitions, instability, high emotion, high need, um, when the personal system is destabilized. How do you explain that observation?
Yeah, it is a really interesting observation. Okay, so these periods of instability, they do seem to increase uh, sensitivity to synchronicities, major transitions, um, uh, relationships reorganizing. They do seem to make the underlying coherence more visible than during stable times. Um, so I think the way to explain this is that systems become more flexible during these transitions. The reorganization uh, accelerates across multiple scales. And this is when systems reach what are called critical states, where small changes can produce very large effects. So, yeah, convergence becomes amplified when systems are transforming, when they're breaking down. Um, yeah, it's an interesting observation for sure.
It's a fundamental observation from my perspective that when people look around to say when they are happening, these coincidences, that this is a commonly reported experience. And what I heard from you is that when the system is unstable, which includes the death of a loved one or the loss of a relationship or the loss of a job as examples, or divorce or major illness, that these unstable systems, which we are, then there's just a little bit, it just takes a little bit to flip into recognizing, as I think what you would say, the underlying coherence that's already there.
Yeah, that's right. And I think what may happen is there's an inverted U relationship between periods of instability and coincidence detection and synchronicity experience. So I think that if the system is very highly ordered and stable, that the detection of synchronicity may not be as high. Other words, in at other times when the system is perhaps a little bit less stable and more unstable. But then once a certain threshold is crossed and the system is too highly unstable or chaotic, then again, maybe the detection of synchronicities falls off again. So I think it's this balance point in the threshold of instability in the system that probably can can indicate a higher experience or threshold of synchronicity. Um, yeah.
Well, that you is fits with some of my own description. When things are stable, people don't see them, or they tend to be smaller variety if you see them. And then when the system is really overly unstable or very unstable, can't see them. But over in this category of overly unstable are people who are psychotic. And many of them report what look to them like meaningful coincidences. Sometimes they become overwhelming as they search for meaning. Somebody manic, for example, might be putting together stuff that doesn't seem to make sense to the observer, but might make sense to the experiencer.
Yeah, it's a really interesting observation, and I think our research together points to this direction that there's a certain level of predictability in the aggregate in terms of mental disorder onset that the Fibonacci ages are in a sense probabilistically predictive in the aggregate of when these mental disorder onsets occur. And so I think that's an example in which the integration of the synchronicities is important, and being able to have a coherent explanation that is meaningful to the person. I think a lot of people struggle because these experiences are so different from what people are used to that they lack a framework for understanding them, and so therefore it just becomes way too much. And because we don't really have frameworks yet to explain these sorts of experiences, although I think that is emerging. I think as we do more research, we can start to develop structural explanations, just like our research is showing that the Fibonacci ages point towards, in the aggregate, mental disorder onset ages. The way I think about it is um, like weather, like lightning, right? Imagine people looking at lightning in the sky 1,000 years ago and just thinking, what is that? And it's just not being able to explain it. But eventually, we developed atmospheric structural explanations that could explain conditions under which those events are more likely to occur. So I think synchronicity is probably going to end up having a similar structural explanation.
That I always love lightning, uh, especially when you ask how many people get struck by lightning, uh, and the numbers that vary by context so much. And here we're getting near the end of our time together here, Rob, and I'm so glad to have had this conversation with you so far. But let's keep in mind that you are a man on a mission, and one of your missions is that you can take the date of birth and predict future events using the Fibonacci sequence. As we get close to the end, could you tell us something about that?
Yeah, so the Fibonacci life chart is not making any predictions in the sense of what is likely going to happen. It's not a predictive model, um, but it does suggest clustering probabilistically um, in terms of coherence, when systems are likely to have higher levels of coherence, multi-scale coherence, because the Fibonacci sequence is fractal. So that is something that it points to, is that these Fibonacci harmonics in the aggregate have uh, multi-scale coherence, and systems that are transforming, that are building up energy, and that are reorganizing at different points in time are more likely to be reorganizing around these thresholds.
And what do you mean by thresholds?
Just points in which a system reaches a critical level that it needs to transform. A really good example of this is the magnetic polarity reversal in the sun. So every 11 years, uh, the sun reverses its magnetic polarity. And so it takes about, on average, 10 years for the buildup in entropy in the sun to reach this level. And then over about the course of 1 year, it reaches a threshold, a critical point in which the the system starts to transform, and so over that period of about a year, then we see that magnetic polarity switch. So and interestingly, that also happens to be a Fibonacci interval when converted into days. It's about 11 years, 11 and a half. So yeah, an example of a physical system that builds up pressure, reaches a threshold, and then reorganizes through emergence and transforms. So I really think human development has those recursively organizing thresholds as well throughout time.
And with that belief, I thought you could begin to predict events in some people individually.
No, it's not making any individual level predictions as to what is likely to happen at these harmonic intervals. It's really just suggesting that these are points in which systems in the aggregate tend to have multi-scale coherent relationships, and in terms of structured probability, we can think about these as amplification windows. So we could say that probability is not evenly distributed across all possible futures, but rather recursive constraints accumulate and make some developmental trajectories more likely to be experienced. And so I think these are amplification windows, periods when the underlying organization becomes especially visible.
And more likely to be changeable is what I get from this. Now, I'm maybe misremembering, but I thought you would like to find out a person's birth date approximately as being able to say something about the future of that person.
Yeah, that is really important because it's an initial condition
Yeah.
for the constraint structure to build up. And so neurodevelopmentally and biologically, from the birth date, there is this probabilistic clustering over time.
And that's what I thought you were talking about, but then you said no, it's probabilistic. It's not predicting anything. It's predicting likelihood of transformation. It's not predicting something specific. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. The structure is biasing the possibility space without determining it.
It's biasing it and without determining it. It just makes the options more open in that probability space. Okay, I got that, and you can do that with almost any date that something starts. And what I've gotten so clearly is what you mean by constraints, because constraints is really vital to all this, and
Yeah.
the constraints at birth are vital to the life of the human being, which gets us into, and we're not talking about it right now, but what astrology tries to do. Uh, and that's, which also is a predisposing um, predictor. It doesn't mean something specific, although people interpret it as. But this idea of constraints from the beginning,
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
Go
It's
ahead.
it yeah, no, it's a critical point of the relational structural explanation is it's very important to shift from moving thinking from causes to constraints and from isolated events to patterns of organization. So that's what the relational framework is really all about. It's getting us to shift our focus from things existing objectively to relationships, and from causes to constraints, and from isolated events to patterns of organization.
Very good, Rob. Very good. I mean, I'm really glad to be able to have this real dialogue with you, because that's what this has been. I got to be able to talk with you, ask you questions, make a few comments, and we haven't had that before. And it's been a great pleasure, beyond pleasure, to be able to see how you think, because it's been a little hard to find that out reading some of what you write, because it gets kind of dense for me. But now I see some of the underlying, let's say, structure, the coherence, uh, intention too, I'll add in there, between what you're doing and how massive the thought processes are that you're evolving, and why at this point you're able to get on a podcast, because now you're able to talk about what you're doing, and you know that, and you have been, and you just did. And I want to thank you very much for talking with me finally after all these years.
Thanks again, Bernard. I really enjoyed our conversation and appreciate the opportunity to be here. All the best.
All the best.